satellites? A satellite represents a journey, information gathering, this journey around the Earth.
Welcome to Satellite Haiku.
Yeah, I'm Shawn.
I'm Milo.
Hey, so I wanted to start off. We have a few paid subscribers. So,
What?
yeah, I know. On Substack, I left it as an option if people wanted to pay to subscribe. So we have 3, I think. So I have to figure out who they are so we can kind of write some thank you notes, but give a shout out to people who have decided to pay a little bit. We should also figure out, like, what do we want to do with that money? We should donate it to something, or we'll talk about that. Yeah. Anyway, so thanks to folks out there who have decided to become paying subscribers. That's very exciting and very generous of you.
Yeah. Thanks, you guys. That's a huge support. And we just hope that we can offer some kind of inspiration or comfort or just entertainment, for people that are. I like to listen to our show when I'm cooking, actually.
Funny. We have a little bit of an NPR vibe, I think, sometimes, which is kind of funny. It's like, I don't know if you ever remember those, the Saturday night, the SNL, like NPR parodies, like it was like 2 ladies talking very quietly in these sort of quiet radio voices. Yeah, I think that hopefully that brings some serenity, but maybe we can dial up the energy sometimes a little bit.
There you go. And you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about parenting. You had some parenting topics.
Yeah. I mean, before we dive into let's talk about some parenting stuff. I definitely had some things I wanted to. I think that can be a good meaty topic for this one. But before we do that, let's. Since we just had Thanksgiving, I had a quick question for you. So sure. I made a couple pies. First of all, you have a pecan allergy or something, right? Is that right? Or am I wrong about that?
Hungry. I did. I developed one by eating Keebler Elves cookies. I used to eat giant swaths or buckets of them, pecan sandies after school, I guess middle school, high school. And I just ate so many that I developed these water blisters in my mouth. Like if I ate a pecan, it would my whole mouth would fill with these nasty water blisters, which I get those from water chestnuts. If I'm eating Chinese food, if I eat a water chestnut, my mouth and they're scary because they happen so fast. Have you ever had one?
I've gotten them. I attributed it to sugar. Like if I eat a bunch of pineapple or something very sweet and a little bit acidic, especially like pineapple is definitely a big one. But other things, if I have too much sugar in too short a time, I'll get little blisters in my mouth. So, not
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine, I thought it was an allergy, but it's gone away. I mean, one of my favorite things is I take Trader Joe's spicy pecans. They sell them as like a sweet and spicy, and I crush them up with a hammer and I sprinkle them on salads and stir fries. That's a little kick.
Ooh, I'll have to look for those. So anyway, I was going to ask you, so I made some pecan pies over the weekend, or, I was going to make one for Thanksgiving, but I didn't. I made one for this bake sale at my kids' school. And are you team pie or team cake?
Well, I think it depends. Like for Thanksgiving, certainly pie. For birthdays, definitely cake, but I think that's kind of a traditional thing. But if it was this time of year, like holidays, like I'm, Thanksgiving, Christmas, for me, the holidays start around your birthday, Halloween, and they end on my birthday, February 13th. So I think of that as the holidays. And so the beginning part of it is all about pie and the last part is all about cakes.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Cause I was firmly in team pie camp my whole life. In fact, even for my birthday, since it is on Halloween, my mom would always make me a pumpkin pie for my birthday instead of having a cake. And I think I've shifted over to team cake. Like if I had to just say it, if I had to just fully live in one camp or the other, pies are like, there's something, this might be like bougie of me, but something more refined about cake. Like a pie is such a simple thing. When I make a pie, it's like, you make a crust and then you just basically dump stuff into the crust and bake it, right? Like there's no technique really involved in a pie. Whereas a cake is this sort of refined thing. It like needs to rise a certain way. And then if it's a layer cake, you have this whole other step where you're putting it together and you're making it look really nice. And you have different frostings you can combine with the cake. And it's like this very, it's like a different level of refinement. And I don't know, maybe it's my age and I'm kind of entering a bougie stage of life. But yeah, I think I've drifted over to team cake. Although I love pie, and I have a pecan pie upstairs that I baked yesterday. So,
I think one thing that someone did over the Thanksgiving, we went to a Friendsgiving, which was like on a Wednesday night because everyone was busy that day, Thursday. And someone who hates pumpkin pie made a cheesecake, pumpkin flavored cheesecake with crushed up ginger cookie crust. And it was delicious. I have to say I ate too much. And the other thing that was interesting is we were talking about why do people hate, like I had this aversion to, do you remember when we were kids how the top of the pudding would get like a skin on it?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, like if my mom didn't stir my oatmeal and there were lumps in the oatmeal, it like made me gag. Like I was like, ugh, like a slimy lump for some reason was like the most horrible thing to eat for me. And then the skin on the top of the pudding, like my sister would like pick it up and like run after me with it because I was so afraid of the skin. Like something about like how it had like it shifted from smooth and goopy to like hard and kind of crusty. I don't know why that transition really freaked me out. And so we're moving out to the Southwest. Flan, flan. In some ways, flan to me is just like pure pudding skin. It's like if someone just decided to make a whole dessert out of pudding skin, And I do really, really enjoy creme brulee, where there's the crunchy top and then the pudding custardy bottom. But it's something about when it's like the transition between the two sort of states of the thing is like ambiguous that it really freaks me out. So anyway, one thing about pumpkin pie is it does fall into that category of, is it like a relative of flan? Like, is it like just pure pumpkin pudding skin that got like repurposed, But so yeah, back to the pudding thing. So how do you feel about those like pudding skin, all those kind of those things?
I'm totally opposite of you because like, when I was a kid, and I haven't had this kind of oatmeal in years, but when we were kids, my mom would get those packets, you'd add the boiling water, right? Like the instant oatmeal, right? Which, by the way, like it takes like 3 minutes to make regular oatmeal. So like making instant oatmeal, it's not as good as real oatmeal and it doesn't take any less time. But anyway, that aside. So we would have the instant oatmeal and I would intentionally try to get lumps in it because I liked the lumps. And when the pudding skin, I like the pudding skin. Like that's, what I don't like about flan is the liquid, like how there's sort of like the caramel, like the sugary caramel liquid that's at the bottom, like on the plate. I don't like that. It's like that seems like it's an accident to me. Like it's not, it seems like that's not, how could that be intentional that you have this custardy dessert and then there's this water on the bottom. So I don't like the liquid part of flan, but pumpkin pie. Yeah, again, like I can see that if you don't like the skin on a pudding, the pumpkin pie definitely has that on top of it. And you could say, I could see your argument that the whole pie texture is in a way like the skin of a pudding.
No, that's interesting. You enjoy the skin, but don't like that treacly syrup at the bottom of the flan. That seems like it like oozed out from somewhere that it shouldn't.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, this fucked up in the fridge. Like it sat overnight and it melted a little, but it's still fine. That's what it seems like to me. Like flan, the liquid part seems like an accident, but yeah, I don't know. There's something about the texture in the oatmeal with the lumps, and then instant oatmeal, the lumps were usually like lumps of the sweetener. So they were, or they, they weren't, they had like the flavor in them, like the lumps
cinnamon, brown sugar, cinnamon, something like that.
And there was often salt, like in the lumps, that like whatever salt was added in that mix of flavors, like those lumps were a little bit salty sweet. And I was like, those are good. Yeah.
That's because you like the concentration rather than mixing it throughout the whole thing.
I liked the texture, and I like the salty sweet surprise of getting one of those lumps in my mouth. But yeah, it's interesting. It makes me think that this is a weird segue, but the relationship is the texture thing. Because I had an argument some years ago with somebody about iceberg lettuce, and he was just totally dissing iceberg lettuce. And he was like, what's the point of iceberg lettuce? It has no flavor. Like, and he was kind of boosting all the other lettuces out there, like red leaf lettuce, and I said, well, iceberg lettuce, the whole point of it is the texture. It adds the crunch to the sandwich. Like, it's not really about the flavor; it's about the texture that it adds. So I do like those. I do like it when I bite into something like a pudding and it has like a couple of different textures, like the skin. I don't mind that. Yeah.
Yeah. And to be honest, what's funny for me is like, it's more like when I make a stir fry, I really like to have multiple different, like a crunchy nut thing that's stirred, like, crushed up cashews or pecans, for instance, and then like a soft piece of zucchini that's been, cooked. Like, I like that when you're biting into a stir fry and there's like multiple textures, like different levels of crunch. So it's not really like that there are different ones. I think it's that on the same thing, there's a transition from gooey to hard. I don't know. But I do recall in 5th grade, I had gone to Lower Moreland. In 2nd grade, gone to the public school surrounding our little hamlet. And there was a kid I would sit at lunch with, and he used to take, we had this nasty, it was like Wonder Bread that would come with your lunch on the tray. I usually packed a lunch, and I hated when the peanut butter and jelly, when the jelly would soak into the bread and make it really wet. So I would ask my mom to put butter on that side to like shield, to create like a grease layer to like protect the bread from the jelly. I don't know if you remember that, but so this kid would take, he knew it bothered me, but he would take this piece of Wonder Bread and he would like smash it up into like a cube shape, and then he would lick it. And there's something about like wet bread that just even looking at it made me want to gag. Like, I would sometimes look in my throat, I would gag, and he would do it on purpose and hold it up, and then he would eat it. And I would just, something about, and I know that it was probably closer to dough at that point. Like, it was just like eating, raw cookie dough that wasn't sweet. But there was something that horrified me about that process that he would do. And he thought it was so funny. But anyway, similar to
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was done. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, you could take, with that Wonder Bread, you could take a whole loaf of it and probably like just with your hands condense it down to like a golf ball size lump. Like, there's so much air in a loaf of Wonder Bread.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Wasn't there a guy? There was a guy that was like, this is like one of those weird crime stories that was probably on like the morning radio or something. But it was like a guy that got arrested for going around grocery stores and squeezing the bread. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that. That was recently or a long time ago?
Yeah, there was like some city. It might have even been, where I live, but it was some city where basically all the stores were finding that their bread section was getting kind of abused. And it was like this thing that was happening from store to store to store. And they were losing loaves and loaves of bread, like hundreds of loaves of bread. And they were just like, what is going on? And they tracked it to one guy who had this weird like fetish about squeezing bread, and he would just sneak into these stores, and when no one was looking, he would like pick up loaves of the white squishy bread, and he'd just squeeze it.
Yeah,
the guy had mommy issues or something.
Yeah, or else his mom had done something. Maybe she squeezed his bread before she gave it to him at the house or something. Anyway, but yeah, it's one thing I did with the Thanksgiving leftovers. We had tons and tons of, I had grilled vegetables like eggplants and zucchinis and mushrooms. And we ended up with a giant leftover box, and I made soup out of it. And it was really yummy. Because
I bet that would be, with roasted vegetables in a soup, that would be good. Yeah.
I threw one extra little butternut squash in there and some onions, and then a bunch of spices like garam masala, paprika. And
Did
then,
you puree it?
Then I pureed it really buttery and smooth, and it just has this interesting texture.
Nice. That sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. I guess, yeah, let's talk about, you brought up last time that you're about to become a grandfather.
Yeah. In April, I'll be a grandfather.
Which is pretty amazing. So you're at a totally different stage of parenting than I am. You're almost into grandparenting. So I was thinking about, like, it would be interesting to talk about parenting stuff just from the two sort of ends of, like, I'm right in the thick of it. You're an empty nester about to be a grandparent, but from the outside, like, your girls, they went to Stanford, they both got black belts, right? They speak multiple languages. They've lived in other countries. Like, so from the outside, like, it's like you have achieved total dominating victory in terms of the parenting, like the parenting competition. And like, what's the recipe for that? Like, how did you have two girls that went to Stanford and all these things? Like, I'm just through the ears of your girls, I'm here, I would probably hear them sort of play a lot of that down. And so, like, I don't want to make it like, that in itself is this, this trophy, going to Stanford or whatever, but it is something that, a lot of parents would sort of, aspire to for their kids or wish for their kids, like, it's a top school and, like, that's definitely a focus. And other things that your girls are just very accomplished and they seem to have arrived there without being kind of anxious or neurotic or like weirdly toxically ambitious and like all the sort of the negative side effects of that kind of set of achievements. So anyway, I guess that would be my starting question. Like, what do you think of as the recipe for that? How did they do that?
Right. So that's it, really. And I've had people ask me this over the years multiple times, and I wish I could take more credit for any of their accomplishments. I feel like in some ways I did that sort of hands-off approach where I just stood there and supported them, gave them the things they needed. And I mean, in some ways, like, I'll go back and say, I remember I was terrified to become a parent. I was living in New York when I found out that my oldest child had been conceived. And I was terrified that I would just sort of felt like I was going to screw it up somehow. Like, I wasn't like sufficiently an adult, that I was still like, I would, like, on my way to work, I would stop off at the cafe, and my mom had brought us up and we were never allowed to have sugar cereals or like sugary things. We always were healthy. So I was like, freedom. And I would stop at the cafe and I would get a chocolate croissant and a strawberry quick. And then like 40 minutes later, I would have like a blood sugar crash and I'd be like, oh, I feel terrible. Like, it took me a while to figure out that, like, that was a terrible idea, even though it sounded like a good idea at the time. And then, like, it always, so I felt like at that point, like, I was still trying to figure out how to be an adult. And I was like, how can I be a parent? So one thing I used to say is that it was just a giant experiment, because none of us really know, like, what, there's all these constants and variants. Like, we have the way we were raised, and did it work or did it not? And then a lot of times we either, grab onto that methodology or we push it away, whether we, what I mean? Like, if you were, a lot of people had strict parents and they became too lax, and then it kind of pulsated back and forth between. So I remember thinking that what I did, like, I was, cooking for the kids. I wanted them to have the best healthy foods. I wanted them to have the right kind of like a relationship to exercise. And then I would read to them and sing to them, every single night before bed. Like, we'd tell stories. And at one point early on, I came across this study that, and the woman who did the study, she took 1,800, her premise was, is it nature versus nurture? Can we do any kind of experiment to figure out at what kind of part of that continuum is the most important, or is there even some kind of difference? So she took 1,800 families they were all women who were professional career people who had waited later in life and were struggling to have their own biological child. So they applied to adopt a child and then got pregnant. So she had 1,800 families, so 3,600 kids, where she had a biological kid and an adopted kid in the same family with the same mom. And they were being raised in the same household. And her idea was, can we learn from this to see? And her conclusion, which she, at the very beginning of the study, spends like 3 pages describing all the flaws in her study. Like, it's only college educated, master's degree level moms in fairly wealthy urban neighborhood. You know what I mean? Like, she had all these, she said, I know it doesn't apply across the board, but at the end of the study, she said, I can only draw the conclusion that nurture does not matter. Yeah. It's just genetics. And I was horrified. A part of me was like, I hear what she's saying and I kind of understand it, but then I honestly just don't believe that that's true. I know that nurturing. Anyway, so at that, how do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think I don't think that conclusion makes any sense. I think to the extent, I don't know, I guess I have a few different thoughts. When I think about my 2 kids, for example, they're very different from each other, right? And so they're raised in the same house. So it seems like you don't even need to look at adopted versus biological kids to see that there's going to be drastic differences from one kid to another, like in the same household. Like my 2 kids, they're raised, equally, but they're different people, and they're just their personalities are different, their temperaments are different, their interests are different, right? So like I parent them differently in the same household. I cater to their differences, right, to some extent. And but then they're in a lot of other ways, I treat them absolutely the same and equally, right? So like that's nature. They're different. So it seems like, just from a experiment design, it seems almost silly that she would even think that an adopted kid would somehow add a variable that is important to that. But then, so when you think of things like, and this might be epigenetics or whatever, but like concept like generational trauma, right? Like if people are, so like my mom often expresses like deep guilt about like mistakes she made raising us, and her mom was like a disaster, right? And so my mom's dad left when she was, when my mom was a kid, he just took off and never came back, right? Like, and then her mom was mentally ill basically, and just was a complete fuck up as a mom, right? So my mom had a really rough upbringing, and I don't know. I had a conversation with her maybe a couple of years ago about just that concept of generational trauma. Like she was not a perfect mom, but like nobody is a perfect parent. I'm guilty about quite a few things as a dad that I've fucked up, right? And that I can recognize now as, oh, that was bad, or just ways that I haven't been able to regulate my own emotions in certain times and I've lost my temper or whatever, right? So like, I feel tremendously guilty about those moments where I kind of lost my temper. I allowed myself to be triggered in the moment or whatever, right? So I think every parent has these things that they feel guilty about. But anyway, what I was going to say about the generational trauma, back to your question, is like, so my mom was, she made in her mind some mistakes, and she did things that she was learning and whatever. She wasn't a perfect parent, but she did a lot better than her mom did. And so like, and I don't want to frame it like I'm trying to do better than my mom did, because I think my mom was an amazing mom. But like, I learned from her parenting style, and there were things that worked for me and didn't work for me. And there's things that I just took away from being raised by my mom that I either will replicate or I will react to, and try to, and then also just the general societal, like you talked about things that you read or whatever, like you pick up things from from your friends and from books and whatever, like each generation is trying to sort of improve upon the previous one. And so like, the only way you can imagine that can even make sense or work is if nurture somehow has an effect. Like if a kid is raised, like we know, for example, I guess it's just too general a question, like nature versus nurture, because when you think about nurture, like if you were a child growing up in Gaza right now, you're going to have like cortisol and adrenaline running through your blood all the time. You might be just experiencing massive grief and trauma, and that has a lasting impact, right? Like that's a form of this nurture that falls under that bucket of nurture. If we're only talking about nature versus nurture, and those are the only two categories, well, like that's the nurture side of it. It's not very nurturing, but it's nurture. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that to just split things into nature versus nurture, there's a whole set of ways you can grow up on the nurture side of that equation, some of which damage your actual biological cells because of the hormones that are coursing through you. You know, if you are just have adrenaline and cortisol and, you know, you're constantly stressed out, right? That actually has a biological effect. You know, you don't live as long and you have health problems later, and, you know, and you might also kind of, you know, that's the generational trauma. You might be a person who has difficulty kind of raising your own kids. And so you're passing on some of that damage that you are, that you have experienced. So anyway, I guess that to me, it makes no sense that nurture doesn't have an effect, because we know that it does. From all of those kinds of things qualify as nurture in that split, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. So first off, the woman who, you know, did this study, and I wish I could remember her name. She said one of the flaws was that her metric that she was using to judge by success was typically how much income they made as a professional, the child, and also how far they went in school. So like if they do college or graduate work, and then did they make, and so she said, I understand that someone who makes more money than someone else might not be happier. So right there, there's like a flaw, because it's just which kid makes more money. Is it the adopted kid or the other kid?
Yeah.
And that's like, she knew that her study was flawed. But I do find it interesting that with 7 billion people on the planet, you can do a lot of observational studies by just looking. For instance, I read one about birth order.
Yeah.
Like first birth order kids typically or have a much higher correlation with success and earning power and, like, you know, stability, financial stability. And that's fascinating. And I don't know why, but you're right. That's not really nature or nurture. That's kind of like a weird happenstance, right? Like it's almost like randomly.
I mean, I guess that's part of nurture, though, right? Like you are parented in a certain way because you're the second or third kid or the first kid, maybe. I don't know. I could see that. But I know there are a lot of, there's a lot of really interesting and compelling evidence for certain kinds of change and development that are kind of built in, right? Like that are just in your nature and that aren't going to change. And there are a lot of, I mean, so I guess I don't want to say that I think nature is the more powerful of the two. I guess from everything that I've sort of read and understand about the question, but I think that I guess I'm sort of finding the same flaws in the study that she pointed out. Like it gets really tricky to isolate what counts as nurture, and also really tricky to decide how to measure success, as you said, because I mean, if somebody grows up and they become like a researcher and they love it and they're thriving as like a, you know, some scientific, you know, researcher in a university lab or something, and they're making $80K a year, you know, and, you know, versus a software developer who's making $200K a year. Like it's weird to decide that the software developer is more successful because of a salary, you know, like,
yeah.
So I don't know, like they could be both master's degree people and all that. But, and the thing that differentiates them is salary, but, like they're both super successful in their fields, I guess you could say. Like, it's weird to say that there's just fields that make more than other fields. So like, that's kind of a weird metric.
And I'll return to my thoughts about my own parenting and my own kids, but I wanted to point out that there is a Netflix documentary about these two sets of identical twins in Bogota, Colombia, and they were swapped in the hospital. And so you imagine you have two identical, and in the hospital they got swapped. And these two went home to the countryside, and these two were raised in Bogota.
So wait, so each pair that was raised was one of the identical twins. So like the identical twins are split.
Yeah.
So in the household, there was the two kids in each household were not twins with each other.
No, and one was biologically related to its parents, and one was like a random kid from somewhere else. And so many things, so many things about the story are incredible. It just is in the sense, if you start to do the math, that one of each family member twin got sick at exactly the same time and had to go to this special pediatric hospital. Mm-hmm. And that's where they got switched. And the mom was too sick to come. So the aunt and the grandmother took that one from the countryside into the city. And when they got switched, they just brought the wrong one home. And like the mom had said, like, I always felt weird about it. Like it never quite made sense. So anyway, so what's fascinating about them, you could never do that as a scientific study. It would be cruel and unusual and just wrong, right? But they offer like tremendous opportunities to study them biologically, as you say, epigenetically.
Yeah.
What they had different food, they had different lifestyles. They had the ones in the countryside didn't have running water or electricity, but there was a lot of rebel attacks. The ones in Bogota had and the ones in Bogota definitely grew up to be like an architect and a lawyer. And the ones in the countryside, didn't. They were like butchers. But it's fascinating to watch how when they meet each other as adults, they're just like, oh my God, the way you laugh is my laugh. Like the way you move, the way you think about the world, the way you're grumpy, like it's so interesting.
I think, and I think that's when I think about the experiments that come to mind for, that basically sort of, that sort of conclude that nature is far more powerful than nurture, or maybe nature is the only thing that matters. A lot of those are twin studies, right? They're identical twins that are split, and they do have these amazing parallels. But I guess that we're not talking in those cases about like, it's like things like how they laugh and like what they're in, like whether they are more sort of like left brain sort of rational interest in that lead them into certain careers versus like, maybe creative careers and things like that. Like those things are really interesting to see the parallels and to see like, oh, that stuff seems to be somehow built in from the beginning. So, like that's sort of a different category of similarities and differences than sort of maybe emotional health and psychological health and well-being and things like that. But yeah, it's interesting.
And I do have friends that are identical twins that are part of a study in Colorado, and they go up once a year. But what's interesting is, even though they're identical, their personalities are so different. Like one's a party girl and the other one like loves to work out and is like a gym teacher. Like they have like completely different personalities. So you really can't say just because they're identical that they're the same. They're so different. So the variety is incredible. But what were you going to say?
Oh, no, that was pretty much it. So, but like bringing that back to your own girls, like what made you think of that question of nature versus nurture when you're talking about, so like what was the connection? Just that you don't feel like, is it just really about that first thing you said where like, I wish I could take more credit? Like you just sort of felt like what they've managed to do in their lives is really just has to do with their nature. Is that what kind of you were saying?
That's it. No, that's a good question. I look back and I think like I think that I look back and think like, first of all, what I didn't do is I never had to prompt them to go do their homework. They just were internally motivated to do a good job in school. And I never had to ask like, hey, in fact, they pushed themselves too hard. My youngest
Were they
daughter,
competitive with each other?
yeah, for sure. And I think the older one had some some photographic memory abilities that made it easy for her to kind of waltz through school. She never brought home a book, for instance. Like she finished all of her homework, like in the lunchroom, talking to people. She could kind of really multitask and like carry on a conversation with you and do the math problems, which was pretty phenomenal. And then the younger one was very competitive, and she learned how to work really hard to achieve her goals. And so when they got to college and there was a tough class, the older one was like, oh my God, I've never had to study before. And this is so hard. And the younger one was like, what are you talking about? I've been doing this for 12 years already. Like you just put your nose down and you stay up late and, you do your work. So it's really funny to watch how later on they, that need to learn to work hard to get what you want, and this sort of ease does change sort of your life trajectory. Early on, the Waldorf School pushed us to do rock climbing. And it was something that the Waldorf School believed, they had this whole belief system around like this sort of, what do they call it? The, like an intellectual mind. And then this kind of like, they call it like this somatic wisdom. They say, imagine when you're dancing to an African beat, like you don't tell yourself, put your left hand out, fling your finger. You don't describe it to yourself. You just feel it. And they said, being burned out later in life comes from overly developing your intellectual mind and not being attached or aware of somatically, like yoga, rock climbing. And they said rock climbing is great because you're problem solving somatically, and you can't intellectualize cross-body tension. You just have to feel what that feels like to activate your core and and so what the cool thing about in the bouldering cave that I learned was you try something and you pop off and there's a strong, loud voice in your head that says, that is impossible. No, I could never do that, right? And then someone gives you some advice or you tried something different and then you actually make the move and you're like, what felt impossible 7 minutes ago, now I can do it over and over again. And like having that success, failure, breakthrough loop, I think was really helpful. And certainly to me and to the girls. And the other thing I would say is, so I didn't have to motivate the kids. They did the self-motivation, which that's not something that I did. I didn't like say like, now I'll go self-motivate. So I can't take credit for the fact that they pushed themselves in school. In fact, my job was to make sure they didn't stay up too late working on the things. A lot of the other kids at the school would take Adderall. And my kids just said, that's speed. Like, I don't want to mess with my brain. Like, you know what I mean? So we would jokingly take these like Klamath green, blue algae drops from the co-op, and we called it whale poop. They'd take it during tests. They would just take drops of this blue-green. I think it was more of a placebo effect, But and also we read that your IQ drops significantly when your blood sugar drops. So during a long test like the SAT, they would take Altoids and just put an Altoid under their tongue just to keep the blood sugar level and things, just little like hacks, like life hacks like that, But other than that, I think our big thing was, I think storytelling was huge. That was a Waldorf inspired influence. They didn't want the kids to watch TV, play with computers, play with phones until they were 7. And they had a whole brain kind of structure, development theory around that. And so I was kind of a hippie, and I did, the Waldorf School is a big part of our lives growing up. You're supposed to bake bread, with the kids, you're supposed to let the kids cook, which I used to joke and say, the Waldorf School has the happiest kids and the worst muffins. Because they overstir the muffins. You know how like little kids are like get into it, and you mentioned just fold the ingredients in, and they just are like, I'll do that. And so I was like, the muffins are super tough, but the kids are happy.
That's funny. I mean, it's interesting because I think like, just going back to the way I framed the question, it was intentionally sort of framed in this winning this context of like this premise of like winning, like you won. But like, I actually really hate that premise of sort of parenting, because I feel like, and so, I mean, that's what I wanted to explore, like the things you were just talking about in that context. But I also want to go back to some of the things you said, which break out of that premise. Because I think that one of the things I encounter in the Bay Area, and probably is rampant everywhere, but like it's definitely a big thing here, is almost like this built-in idea of like, how can we win parenting? You know what I mean? And it's about this definition of success, of like, kind of like what that woman was saying, like, who can make more, are my kids going to be making a lot of money someday? Just like sort of left-leaning people here, and I count myself among them in a way, whose kids are not in the public school system, right? Like, we believe in public schools, but we don't actually put our kids in the public schools. And, just speaking personally, like my wife and I, we put ourselves into the public school lottery, because in the city it's a lottery and it's sort of like luck of the draw which school you get. And, she was raised Catholic. And so the idea was that if our kids got into a public school, one of our top, 8 or 7 or 8, if that was the one that because you rank the schools on the for the lottery, you rank which ones you want. Anyway, so we said, all right, if our kids get into one of the public schools, then my wife would want to send them to whatever Sunday school. I forget what they call that in the Catholic in the parish here, but or in the archdiocese or whatever. But there's like a Sunday school basically to learn all the Catholic stuff. And then, if our kids go to Catholic school, well, then they don't have to do the Sunday school thing. And, so my wife kind of joked like, oh, if they go to public school suddenly, then it's going to be my job to do all the Catholic stuff for them, to help them learn all that. So, as it turned out, it was just sort of luck of the draw. We got into a totally random school that was on the other side of town. It would have been like a nightmare trying to get our kids there every day. And so we enrolled them in Catholic school. But that's a long digression. I guess there is this, the point of that was just that this notion of like winning parenting as a premise at all is kind of gross, I guess. But some of the things you kind of talked about along the way, like the rock climbing thing, was you sort of spoke about it as it's sort of designed to build a certain kind of somatic skill set, right? Or mindset. And, but the other thing that it did, the side effect, I guess, is that you're doing this with your kids. Like, you are engaging in something with them together. And I guess for me, like, I think that, to me, maybe that's even more important than the somatic sort of lesson they take away, or the somatic sort of growth, learning, whatever that you kind of described. The thing that maybe the more valuable thing that happened there was you were doing something with them and engaging something. So, because I think about like things that I try to do with my kids, like I spend time, I just sit with them and listen to, and we'll just watch what they're doing, right? Like I just show interest in, and it's not just a performance. Like, I'm interested in like, oh, what are you drawing? Or like, what are you playing on the computer or whatever? Like, and I let them tell me about it and show me, right? Even if it's just some computer game or some video, like, my son loves to share all the stuff that he's into. Like, it was Pokemon cards at one point, and he knew all the Pokemon, and it was boring as fuck to listen to it, right? Because he knows it to a depth that is like ridiculous, right? Like, he knows all of their, well, this is a grass type, and the grass type, like, you can't fight the fire type. Like, he's vulnerable to fire type, and blah, 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 right? Like this, but he has this attack and he can do this, right? And whatever, right? So, but it would go on and on and on and on and on. But just like being there with him, and that's an example of something maybe I wasn't that interested in Pokemon, but there are plenty of things that we talk about together, like music, right? Like, he'll listen to a song and we'll talk about the song, and we'll talk about the parts of a song. And he's really like a good listener to music. Like, he's a very careful listener, he notices things. And we have these really cool conversations about music together. And so to me, like, I think if you just are doing things with your kids, like if you are in their lives in a way that just they feel is genuine and interested, like that builds like that itself builds a crazy good like that builds a really good foundation, right? Like, so I think that's part of what, even though that's not exactly what you focused on, that's a thing that was through, like, baking bread together. Like, maybe there was a thing you were supposed to learn about bread and chemistry or whatever. I don't even know, but like the act of doing it is super valuable, right? And the telling of stories and all that.
You know, it makes me think of early on, like my first introduction into like an academic investigation of parenting was through my the mom of my daughters, my ex-wife now. She was studying at NYU and getting her master's in bilingual special ed. So she was studying, and she took a course with this woman who wrote a book called Uncommon Sense. And she had a lot of radical ideas about the classroom and how to behavior issues and how to deal with them. But one of the things that she said and said is a truism is that the schools, New York City has, you know, a vast diversity of public schools. And she said the schools where the kids do the best, where the kids thrive, are the schools where the parents are involved with everything. Like if the parents want to know what they're studying, if they come into all the meetings, if they do the bake sales, when the parents are involved, she said the kids do really well, regardless of any other factor. Like that's just across the board, the schools where the parents don't ever come, or they're not around and the grandparents raising them and they just sit in front of the TV, those kids just don't do as well. And she said, like, it's hard because the teacher can't do much to change that. Like the teacher in a public school can't get the parents to get involved. So it's like Sisyphean.
Well, it's such a privilege to be able to be involved as a parent. Yeah. Like, you know, it's not every parent that can be involved, but there's a sort of a dark side of that coin too, because I think parents are nightmares when it comes to being involved. Like there's that helicopter parenting that happens too. That's insane. Like one of my friends here was a private school teacher at a very posh girls' school. And the stories she tells about parental involvement are just, you know, they're harrowing. They're terrible. Like you would not want to have anything to do with any of these parents. And you know, they're involved to a degree that is utterly toxic. So like there's a moderation there. So that, I guess that's a whole other thing. So like one of the things, so somebody, I was talking to somebody about discipline and punishment and things like that, because like, I honestly have, I don't know if I've ever, you know, quote unquote punished, or if we've ever quote unquote punished our kids, right? Like there have been a handful of times where we sent them to their rooms because they were just in such a meltdown mode that they just needed quiet for a minute. But it wasn't about punishing them like a timeout. It was like, hey, you know, like let's, you know, go in your room where you're not raising the stress level of the entire house, and you can just like breathe for a few minutes and then come out. It wasn't like 10 minutes you have to be in your room. It was just kind of like, and you know, like it, you know, many of those times I would go in to the room with the kid and just sit there in silence, just hold the space with them, right? And just be with them. And so like, you know, only later did I learn that that's actually a really good technique, because this idea of sending your kid away when they're being, you know, difficult is sort of a shaming, you know, they end up feeling sort of like, oh, well, if I'm difficult, then you don't love me. Right. So like, and I can't say that I'm always been the person that goes in the room when they're being like in total meltdown, but like, I try to remember that is a thing that helps. And there have been many times where I want to be in that room, or like I'll send, you know, they'll go to their room for a minute and I'll come in a minute later and then I'll sit with them or whatever. Right. And so, sometimes they don't want me there, but then, you know, like a minute goes by and we're just sitting there in silence. And there's something really healing about that. And also just relationship building. Right. So I guess like I never, and maybe this will change when they're teenagers and they're doing things that have real consequences. Because the stuff that I would, potentially punish them for now, like saying an unkind thing to each other or like, whatever, like I think of the things that other parents might punish their kids for at my kid's age. And those are silly things, right? Like they don't have a developed prefrontal cortex yet. Right. So like if a kid is triggered by something and they say something mean or rude or whatever, it's not really that they're being rude or mean. It's just they don't have the ability to regulate their emotional triggers, right? So like it's weird to punish them for that. Like I said, maybe my approach or my philosophy around that will change when they're teenagers. But I don't know, did you punish your kids? Was there discipline?
No. And I would say, I think, when they became teenagers, I made some rules about, for instance, like, can a boyfriend spend the night? No. Can they go camping together by themselves? Like I made some rules and I got caught some flack and was told like, oh, you're so small-minded and you're stuck in your, ultra conservative religious upbringing ways. And I was like, well, I guess, I'm trying to sort of scan the horizon and see like, what are the things I want to keep and what are the things I'm going to let go. But one thing I do remember being very conscious about, and I made a discerning effort to not perpetuate. I never felt good. I was raised, and I, adore my parents, but they used the Dr. Spock method, and there was a lot of guilt and a lot of blame. Like if someone broke a cup or something, it was like, who broke this cup? And you needed to be like identified and shamed. Yeah. And I said to my girls, I was like, I just never liked that. I hated how it felt. I felt prickly and nasty and like this sense of dread. And so we had this thing, and that you could ask the girls, like, if they ever spilled a glass of milk or shattered something on the floor, my whole thing was, as a community, we would just work together to clean it up. Mm-hmm. Like no blame, no guilt. I said, no one got out of bed and was like, let's just screw up the day by spilling milk out at a restaurant or something. You know what I mean? Like I just was like, no, I give them the benefit of the doubt. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm proud of that worked well. And I never sort of brought the guilt and shame that I didn't like from my childhood into our world. I would say one thing that I was overly protective. People used to tease me that I was a Jewish mother trapped in a Scottish man's body, and I was just like always like trying to protect them from things. And I remember being on a walk with my sister, and her daughter was, younger than my kids. She was maybe 2, and she was running along the sidewalk, and they came to a place where the sidewalk was, there was a big, huge gap, and she tripped and just face planted and skinned along. And I like leapt out to sort of care for her. My sister put her hand on me and was like, wait, just wait. And we watched, and she got up and kind of went, like brushed herself off and then laughed and kept running. And I was like, oh, I missed the opportunity for my kids to do that, because I always jumped in and comforted them and it's so sad, like that. And I felt like I could have done that differently, but it wasn't in my nature. So.
It is funny. You do see some kids that will fall and immediately look at their parents to see like, what is my reaction to hurting myself supposed to be? And they're looking for their parents' reaction. Because there's that I guess that notion of allowing natural consequences. Like that's a battle I have with my wife for sure. Like I way lean towards allowing natural consequences. And so the kids will be fighting with each other, right? And her impulse is to say, what do you do? What's happening? What's going on, right? And to kind of intervene and solve the fight. And like if I can handle the noise of it, what I want to do is allow them to work it out, right?
Yeah.
And like they will, and they do. So like that's a different kind of, but I guess one thing that came to mind as you were talking was I also don't like that shaming kind of parenting. And that, I don't know if my parents particularly, they definitely had used to some extent the Dr. Spock method. It was big back then, right? I don't remember seeing that book around the house, but I remember it being mentioned once in a while. But like I developed a mantra for myself that applies to a lot of areas, but I've applied it a lot to parenting. And it basically is this helping, or would this help? And so like one of the examples in that situation that you described, like somebody drops something or breaks something, right? And knowing who did it, does that help like in what way does it help to know who did it, right? And so another example is just those rhetorical questions, like, what are you doing? Like, that's not a question you actually, like, if you go into your kid's room and they're supposed to be doing homework and they're doing something else, right? And you say, what are you doing? Like, that's a rhetorical question. You don't actually want them to answer the question like, oh, I'm watching a video, right? Like you don't want the answer. There's no reason to ask that dumbass question, what are you doing? And in fact, the way the tone is in that question most of the time is a shaming kind of tone. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Right? That's what it's really built into that question. And so like, that's another one, like those rhetorical questions that you don't really want the answer to. Does it help to ask that question? No, it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help. You want the kid to do homework, right? So like, get to the thing that you want. Like, hey, you're supposed to be doing homework now. That's what you want to say, right? Like, hey, I really need you to do, in fact, an even better one. And I try to use I statements, right? Like, I really need you to finish your homework before you do that, right? Like, make it about yourself. Like, and then, that's an agreement, or we have an agreement that you do homework, right? Like, there's lots of ways to get to the point. Saying, what are you doing is a stupid way to start that conversation. So like, for me, it's not about like this or that technique. Like, the thing that the very first principle, the core principle I try to have is this helping? And so like, there will be lots of times where I say something or do something, and immediately as I'm saying it, that mantra comes to mind. So, oh, I'm doing a thing that isn't helping. And then I go, oh, what would help in this situation, right? Like, what's the outcome that I want? Well, the outcome is I want him to be doing his homework. So let me get there quickly, right? So, because I think a lot of those, and there's this, I read a book, we were having like battles with our daughter who has ADHD. And so like, one of the things about people with ADHD is they have this very off or on emotional state. Like my wife was just texting me today about a talk she saw at work where the guy who was delivering the talk about neurodivergence in the workspace or whatever, he has ADHD, and he was saying like, I have two modes. I have namaste and I have, I'm going to cut you, bitch. Right. And so, we have these battles with our daughter because she goes from 0 to 100. Like, she'll just like melt down. And so we read this book called Parenting Without Power Struggles, which is an amazing book, actually. But one of the things that I got out of that book is she talks about 3 styles of interactions with your kid: captain, lawyer, or dictator. And so the captain is the one you want. It's basically, that's a person you're like, if you're on a ship and you're part of the crew or you're a passenger, you want to feel like you're in good hands with the captain. The captain has authority. They can get things done, but they have authority because people respect that person and admire that person. And they just sort of have a natural authority, right? And so the lawyer is when you go into your kid's room and say, what are you doing? And they say, whatever. And then you engage in a legal battle about like, why you should be doing this. And like, well, no, you told me, but you just told me 5 minutes ago that, no, I didn't tell you that. And then you're in an argument about what happened 5 minutes ago. Right. And then, then you're in a court case about like, okay, can you present the evidence about what happened 5 minutes ago? What did I say? And so, well, you said this. Okay, well, I didn't say that. Well, I meant this, right? And you're in this really stupid legal battle with your kid about who said what 5 minutes ago. Again, is that helping? No, it's stupid. But I really like that framing of like, oh, I'm being a lawyer right now. Like that doesn't help. Like there's no, and then the dictator, that's an obvious one. Like that's when you just want compliance from your kids. They're not doing the thing that you need them to do from any internal motivation. It's really about they're just complying with rules. And, that to me is like one of the things I am aiming for as a parent is having kids who are willing to talk to me and share things with me when they're older, right? And if they're just compliant, like I was just compliant as a kid in a lot of ways. And so I was never, once I got older, I was like, I never felt like I wanted to share my struggles with my parents. Like I didn't want to talk to them about stuff. Like they were just people that set rules. Later, my mom to some extent, and that was about starting to see my mom as a person rather than a parent. That's different relationship. But anyway, I guess I went on for a long time, so I don't know if you have any reaction to any of that.
Well, I have a funny story that touches upon those, like the captain, the lawyer, and the dictator. So I remember early on, my oldest daughter was like very verbal I don't know if you remember, she'd be 2 and she could speak in whole sentences and kind of shock you. Like, and what she was also really, really adept at was being the lawyer. Like she would come up and make proposals. She'd be like, I know my bedtime's at 8. But I really want to stay up and watch ER because I want to become a doctor or a nurse. And so it will help me to watch the show. It'll inspire me. And if I take a 2-hour nap, then theoretically I'm only losing 1 hour, but I'm gaining 2. So it makes perfect sense. As long as I take a 2-hour nap, I should be allowed to break the rule and go 1 hour longer. And I would be like, well, yeah, that sounds reasonable, but no. And then she'd be like, well, why? And I would kind of freeze up and she'd be like, are you going to go with because I said so? And I would be like, yeah. And she'd be like, okay, all right. Like, and I felt like I had been humiliated as the captain. Like I'd been told that like, hey, we're going to turn and go into this harbor. And it's like, no, we're going to go here. And they're like, you're really just going to go there just because you said so? And I'd be like, yeah. Like I couldn't come up with it. That was a good argument, right? Like it was reasonable. There was, you know what I mean? But it just felt wrong. It felt like you don't let your kid, it's probably rated R, like I probably shouldn't have been letting her watch it at all. But she had this thing about like, I want to watch the doctors. And anyway, so that was pretty funny. She used to do that to me a lot. She would kind of would get down to the gritty and be like, so your argument is that just because you said so, like you're the captain. And then she would roll her eyes and kind of walk off, and I would be like, dang it. Because I did want there to be a sense of consensus. Like we're all here to do better and to improve and to be part of like contributors to the world and to be happy and healthy. And like, I felt like if we could get on this kind of like democratic socialist jaunt of just like trying to be as a family, like a little utopian society, and I did believe that we could get there. And so it was that's where it was. And
yeah, from that standpoint, you don't want to fall back on because I said so, because you're no longer in that democratic society anymore.
Right. So I did struggle with that a little bit. And then the other thing I would say that I did is we definitely brought in humor, like constantly. I wrote jingles about what we were doing as a family, and everything was very lighthearted. And so like, I felt like that was something that I wanted to intentionally weave into the fabric of our life as a family, was humor, like, and even if there was like a tense standoff, like I would try to make that humorous, like to change the perspective,
There's a delicate balance there because like when I'm able to, say, for example, when my daughter's having a tantrum about something, right? And when I'm able to be regulated about it, if it doesn't trigger me at all, and I'm getting better at that. I've gotten better at that over the years. I sometimes can just smile because sometimes the thing she's getting so bananas about is silly, right? Like it's really, and she knows it on some level, but she's just like gone from 0 to 100, right? And so she'll see me start to smile and she'll start to laugh, right? Like there's a delicate balance to injecting humor in those tense moments where you're not mocking the person,
right?
That you're laughing, you're engaging in humor with them, not at them, right? Like there's a delicate balance there, but it definitely is a thing that I found very helpful for sure. Yeah,
it's true. And one of the things that that I used to use, like, when you're out at a restaurant with your kids and they sense that like there's a level of discomfort that you'll feel if they have any kind of a tantrum or draw attention to themselves to get what they want. Like, give me the iPad. And you're like, we're not going to watch the iPad. And like, ah, and like, you just want to give them the iPad. Right. So, what was my point? We were talking about, so I used to use what my friend, from NYU said was Jedi mind tricks. Like if they were fighting at a restaurant, I would just go like squirrel. Like I would be like, the kids, look, and the kids, and that, don't you think he looks really sad? Like I would just make up a story about another family, and then they would completely forget about what they were fighting about. And so I never was quite sure if that was like a trick that I used because I was uncomfortable, Like so,
no, there's got to be a name for that. There's some kind of like, there's just obviously distraction, the squirrel thing, but like sometimes if you just take a 90-degree turn from like what your impulse is to do, if you just go like, you don't push in that direction, you don't go opposite, you take a weird sideways turn and you go and you say something that they would just not expect at all.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Like sometimes. And you try to feel that thing that they don't expect at all too. Like sometimes I'm trying to think of a good example, but like sometimes I just try to say the weird thing in the moment when my kids are having like a dysregulated moment. Like I'll just come up with a weird perspective on it, just a super weird way to like. It might be a meta thing about the moment. Like, oh wow, like that sound that came out of your throat when you were really screaming there, didn't that sound to both of us like a chicken? Like it sounded like a chicken. And sometimes that'll make them mad, but sometimes that'll be like it's such a weird, unexpected thing to say. So sometimes there is the art of the weird sideways turn that I think can help. Yeah. But I think I guess the one last thing I would say, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, but like one of the things I observed in you and heard with your whole, because you had kids way before I did, right? Like one of the things that I noticed was you were always talking about who your kids were, like their personalities and the things that they enjoyed and that you enjoyed about them. And like, what I'm trying to get at is that you talked about them as people. They were fully formed human beings of their own. And to me, that might be the most important thing. Like this is one of those things where like when I learned about gentle parenting, I was like, oh, I've been doing all these gentle parenting things before I knew that was a thing. And one of the sort of the core principles of gentle parenting is just see your kids as people. Mm-hmm. Like they are just other people. And when they're triggered or emotional or dysregulated, it's like I can think of a time that I was dysregulated by something, and it wasn't never in the history, like just, as how would people react when this is getting back to that, is this helping thing? Like, like if your impulse is to say, hey, calm down, like has calm down ever helped anybody calm down in the history of humanity? Right. So like, if you just think of your kids as people, hearing the phrase calm down, like you automatically know what you would do if you heard that phrase, right? So like, what would anybody do when you tell a dysregulated person to calm down? It's not going to work, right? So just seeing your kids as people. And I think that, I think that's something that I always, maybe I learned to some extent from you and other people that like obviously enjoyed their kids as fully formed human beings.
Yeah. And I was also just really curious to see like who they were and what they were becoming and what their interests were. So, and I think, but it's funny that you say the calm down, like one of the things I liked to do was think sort of like bioengineer, sort of like who's the guy that does the hacks? The if instead of saying calm down a bit, I would say like, I've read that, the Navy SEALs practice box breathing. And if you can do 2 in, hold 2, 2 out, to hold, hold 2 out. And then if you can expend it to 3, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, it works really well. It just biomechanically will calm you down. And so they would be like, and they would try it, and then it's like, hey, that does work. It's a biohack, You know, like when you're dysregulated, there is something you can do.
Yeah.
And it gives you a course of action that will take you out of the dysregulation. And you don't have to feel like someone's telling you to calm down, because we've agreed that, like, wow, this actually works, you know? And so to me, it was more the interest in the engineering of the human body and the way it works. And, you know, we were always looking at those kind of things.
Right at the beginning of that thought, you used the word curious. And just like you said, I was curious about who they were and what they were interested in. I just think that is like, that's a beautiful way to express seeing somebody as a fully formed human being and being curious and interested in who they are as people. Like that, because we talked a lot about, like, or I kept using examples that were about, like, being dysregulated in punishment and situations that are tense and all that. But, like, there's so much more beauty in what you just said, which is about kind of just that, having that interesting curiosity in who they are as humans.
Yeah.
How do you want to close this out? Anything?
Let's do a very quick first world problems. Do you have anything?
Yeah, this is a thing that I complain about a lot. It's just that there's too many of everything. Like when you go to the store, and it's like toothpaste, right? Like there's 57 kinds of each brand of toothpaste. And you know, like if you want Tom's, you have to choose, like, do I want the white teeth or the fresh breath or the killing germs? Like why do you need to choose? Why not just put all the things? I want all those things. Just put all the things in every toothpaste and just have one, like maybe 2 different flavors, but like there's just way too many things. If you go to buy like a box of Triscuits, there's like 70 kinds of Triscuits now.
That's true.
Like what?
That's true.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing. My thing is it's starting to get chilly here. Our heater broke and I have to fix it. But I'm looking at this idea that, like, it's very common to wear, you know, layers. And if I wear like anything, like a hoodie, I sweat too much. Like I run hot, you know, so I sweat under my arms and I don't use antiperspirant. I use deodorant. And so I'm looking for, like, I kind of envision like wearing like gloves and sleeves and then like a t-shirt, but I think it looks really wacky, you know, like I don't think that's sort of practically what would work for me is like glove. My hands are cold and my forearms, but my torso is too hot. So like, I don't really fashion wise see that like gloves and sleeves really work. So I just am stuck. You know?
I think if there's anybody in the world that could pull off gloves and sleeves as a fashion choice, I think it's you. Okay. All right, my brother. Much love.
All right, brother. All right, you too. Okay, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Satellites? A satellite represents a journey, information gathering, this journey around the Earth.